They do not panic when you cry. They do not break down when you beg. They do not collapse when you pack your bags and leave. They collapse when you simply stop caring. The very moment a narcissist realizes that they can no longer reach you emotionally, their entire inner structure begins to fracture quietly, internally, and irreversibly. If this resonates with you, and if you have lived through this exact reality, take a quick moment right now to pause, subscribe, like, or save this video. Do not do it for me, but do it as a personal reminder to yourself that walking away was never a sign of weakness. Now, let us continue. When you begin to emotionally withdraw from a narcissist, their very first internal response is not pain, nor is it a sense of loss. It is pure disbelief. Their entire way of understanding relationships is built on a single core assumption, which is that you are permanently accessible to them on a psychological level. You might threaten to leave them. You might sit down and cry in front of them. You might yell, raise your voice, and argue with them. You might even create physical distance between the two of you for a short while. But in their mind, you are still completely tied to them as long as you are having an emotional reaction. That is precisely why, when you finally give up quietly and without any dramatic outbursts, it does not register in their mind as an ending. Instead, it registers in their system as a temporary malfunction. They automatically assume that you are just upset, overwhelmed, exhausted, or simply trying to get them to reassure you. They genuinely believe that time will eventually reset you, mainly because historically, that is what has always happened. This deep belief is constantly reinforced by their long pattern of intermittent reinforcement, where a period of cold withdrawal is almost always followed by re-engagement, keeping them fully convinced that they are completely indispensable to your life. Your sudden calm completely disrupts that established pattern. Your total lack of an emotional reaction creates a deep sense of cognitive dissonance inside their mind. They suddenly begin replaying your most recent interactions over and over, searching for any subtle cues that might confirm their continued dominance over you. When they search and cannot find any of those old cues, they simply dismiss your behavioral change as something temporary. This is not driven by hope or optimism. It is driven entirely by a sense of toxic entitlement. Narcissistic psychology relies heavily on the steady predictability of emotional supply. And you have always been a reliable source of that supply. In their internal logical framework, people simply do not walk away unless they are actively pushed out the door. Since they did not formally discard you themselves, your departure cannot possibly be real to them. This state of denial serves a very specific purpose because it protects their deeply fragile self-concept. To accept the fact that you actively chose emotional detachment would force them to acknowledge something horrifying to them. It would require them to admit that they were not essential, that they were not irreplaceable, and that they were no longer in total control. That single realization is far too destabilizing for them to handle at this stage. Therefore, they minimize your absence, they rationalize your sudden silence, and they may even mock your emotional distance, viewing it as a sign of weakness or childish immaturity. They tell themselves that you are probably sitting around waiting for them to notice your distance, that you will naturally return to them once they ignore you for long enough, or that you are just playing games and attempting to manipulate them. Thinking in this way keeps their internal hierarchy completely intact while buying them valuable time to figure out how to regain their leverage over you. This state of confused denial is not a passive phase. It is a calculated, defensive holding pattern that is specifically designed to preserve their feeling of superiority while they assess the potential threat. This phase persists until your absolute consistency forces reality to intrude upon their fantasy world, creating the very first structural fracture in their psychological armor. Once that initial denial can no longer be maintained, the narcissist experiences something far more deeply destabilizing than normal sadness or grief. They experience a profound ego injury. This reaction is not about missing you as a unique human being. It is about suddenly losing access to the specific psychological function that you served in their life. You were never merely a partner, a close friend, or a supportive presence in their world. You were a vital regulator of their self-worth. Your attention consistently confirmed their sense of importance. Your emotional reactions validated their sense of power. Your ongoing emotional labor stabilized their fragile identity day after day. When you finally disengage emotionally, that entire regulatory system immediately fails. The narcissist begins to feel completely exposed, heavily diminished, and internally threatened, even if they are unable to consciously articulate why they feel this way. This severe ego injury strikes directly at the core of their self-concept, which is constructed entirely on external affirmation rather than any genuine internal stability. Without your continuous responsiveness, they experience a sudden and massive drop in their own perceived value. This does not happen because their inherent worth as a human being has changed, but because the psychological mirror that constantly reflected their importance back to them has suddenly gone dark. This dark mirror creates an intense level of internal discomfort, which they often experience as sudden irritation, continuous restlessness, or a persistent, vague feeling of being disrespected by you. They might start fixating on tiny, insignificant details, replaying past conversations in their head, or feeling an uncharacteristic sense of deep vulnerability that they quickly reject and suppress. An ego injury is deeply rooted in intense shame, and shame is an emotion that is completely intolerable within narcissistic psychology. Rather than sitting down to process that shame, they immediately externalize it onto you. They quickly decide that you are ungrateful, completely disloyal, or emotionally and mentally unstable. This sudden reframing allows them to avoid confronting the true threat, which is the undeniable realization that their emotional influence over your life has finally come to an end. This severe injury also completely disrupts their deeply held sense of hierarchy. Narcissists operate entirely on an unspoken internal ranking system where they must always sit at the top as superior beings while everyone else must remain below them in a state of emotional dependence. Your sudden detachment feels to them like an act of total insubordination. It directly violates the unspoken contract you carried, which dictated that you would always continue to provide admiration, constant reassurance, or intense emotional engagement whenever they demanded it. This perceived act of rebellion makes the injury feel not just personal, but deeply humiliating to their core. They may begin subtly testing you to see if the internal wound can somehow be repaired. They might start dropping subtle hints, making indirect comments, or actively fishing for any kind of reaction from you. When those subtle attempts completely fail, the ego injury becomes even deeper. This phase is defined by extreme internal instability, rather than an immediate, visible collapse on the outside. Outwardly, they may still try to appear remarkably confident, completely unfazed, or entirely dismissive of you. Internally, however, they are desperately struggling to reconcile the sudden loss of your supply with their deep belief in their own ultimate dominance. This struggle creates a rapidly growing fracture between who they desperately believe they are and what your continuous absence is revealing about the truth. When this severe ego injury sets in, the narcissist does not stop to reflect on their actions, nor do they take time to grieve the loss of the relationship. Instead, their internal system is flooded with a sudden sense of extreme urgency. Control must be reestablished at all costs. The total loss of your emotional availability creates a profound sense of psychological instability. For a narcissistic psyche, any form of internal instability feels extremely dangerous. They are driven entirely by the core belief that if they can just provoke a reaction from you, literally any reaction at all, then the entire rupture in the dynamic can be completely reversed. This urgent need is the exact reason why their behavior during this period often becomes so wildly inconsistent and confusing to watch. During this frantic phase, they might suddenly appear attentive, deeply apologetic, or intensely concerned about your well-being. They do not do this because they have gained any real insight or genuine remorse, but simply because warmth and attention are tools that they know have worked effectively in the past. If that soft approach fails to get a response from you, Heavy pressure immediately follows. They might start attempting to guilt you, reminding you of all their past sacrifices, or framing your emotional distance as an act of calculated cruelty on your part. The ultimate goal behind these actions is never genuine resolution or healing. The goal is strictly re-engagement. Even an outburst of intense anger from you is vastly preferable to your absolute silence, because your anger proves to them that they still have psychological access to your mind. They may escalate their efforts by constantly inserting themselves into your awareness through indirect methods. They might start mentioning your name to mutual acquaintances, posting carefully targeted performative content on social media, or deliberately aligning themselves with specific people they know will trigger your jealousy, comparison, or insecurity. These erratic behaviors are not impulsive accidents. They are calculated, strategic attempts to forcibly restore the old emotional hierarchy. In their internal logic, emotional connection equals total control, while emotional disconnection represents an unacceptable threat to their survival. What makes this particular stage so intensely destabilizing for them is that their usual time-tested tactics are no longer producing any predictable results. Every single unanswered message, every neutral response, and every quiet boundary you maintain deeply heightens their underlying anxiety, driving them to try a completely different tactic moments later. This desperation leads to rapid, jarring shifts in their overall tone. They can easily swing from charm to deep contempt, or from intense longing to complete dismissal, sometimes all within the span of a few short hours. This erratic inconsistency is a direct reflection of their growing internal disorganization. They are not adapting to the reality of the situation in a healthy way. They are scrambling desperately behind the scenes. Underneath all of these chaotic attempts lies a rapidly growing realization that the fundamental dynamic has shifted in a way that they never authorized or approved. To a narcissist, that specific realization is completely intolerable. As a result, they double down on their efforts. They convince themselves that sheer persistence will eventually wear you down, simply because in the past, persistence was always enough to break your boundaries. When that persistence fails to yield results, a massive wave of frustration builds inside them. This is not a sadness or frustration over losing you as a human companion, but a bitter frustration over losing their valuable leverage over you. Your quiet refusal to engage fully deprives them of the constant emotional feedback loop that they rely on to regulate their fragile self-image. These continuous control attempts represent their absolute last effort to restore that feedback loop before much darker, far more volatile emotions come to the surface. The longer you remain completely unavailable emotionally, the clearer it becomes to them that the old rules no longer apply to your life. That final recognition marks the true beginning of a much deeper internal unraveling. When repeated attempts to regain control fail, the emotional pressure inside the narcissist shifts into something much darker and far more volatile. What emerges is rage, but not always in obvious or explosive ways. This rage is deeply rooted in shame, and shame is the exact emotion they are least equipped to tolerate. Your emotional absence forces them to confront a reality they have spent their entire lives avoiding. It forces them to realize that they are not as powerful, desirable, or influential as they believed. This realization feels like total exposure. It feels utterly humiliating. Because narcissistic psychology cannot sit with humiliation internally, that feeling must be projected outward. The rage may appear subtle at first, often disguised as sarcasm, dismissiveness, or sudden coldness. They may begin devaluing you in their mind, reframing your withdrawal as proof that you were flawed, weak, disloyal, or mentally unstable. This is not an accurate assessment of who you are. It is an emergency repair job on their fragile self-image. In their mind, if you are defective, then their loss of control is completely justified. If you are cruel, then their anger is entirely righteous. The mask they present to the outside world often remains intact during this phase. To everyone else, they may appear calm, reasonable, or even like the victim in the situation. Internally, however, there is an intense sense of being wronged, disrespected, and stripped of their authority. This deep sense of mistreatment fuels growing resentment. They may replay specific moments where you did not respond, magnifying those moments into massive acts of personal betrayal. They may fantasize about future confrontations, ultimate vindication, or scenarios in which you finally realize what you lost. In some cases, this rage leaks out through active smear campaigns or passive-aggressive behavior designed specifically to punish you for your autonomy. What makes this stage particularly destabilizing for them is that the rage does not actually bring relief. It does not restore their control. It simply confirms the loss over and over again. Each attempt to discharge anger externally fails to resolve the underlying injury, which only deepens their internal sense of powerlessness. They may constantly oscillate between furiously blaming you and completely denying that you ever mattered at all, creating further internal tension. The rage exists because your detachment has removed their ability to regulate themselves through you, leaving them flooded with heavy emotions they cannot process, manage, or soothe. These are emotions that continue to build beneath the surface without any real resolution. After rage loses its effectiveness, the narcissist's internal state shifts into something even more consuming and unsettling. It shifts into obsession. This is the exact point where you occupy their mental space far more than they will ever admit to anyone. This does not happen because of love or genuine longing, but because your emotional absence has created an unanswered question they simply cannot tolerate. Narcissistic psychology depends entirely on total certainty about their position and their impact on others. When you disengage and remain consistent, you become an unresolved anomaly in their system. They begin monitoring you directly or indirectly, scanning constantly for any evidence that they still matter to you. This may involve checking your social media profiles, asking mutual contacts about your life, or replaying old memories to locate the exact moment where control slipped through their fingers.